Okay, terrific. So thanks everyone for inviting me, which is amazing to get feedback from a group like this. So the paper is titled Zero-Sum Thinking, the Evolution of Effort Suppressing Beliefs in Economic Development. And it's with Jean-Paul Carvalho, who's a professor at Oxford, Augustin Bergeron, who's a professor at University of Southern California, Joseph Henrich, who's a professor at Harvard University, myself, and Jonathan Weigel, who's a professor at UC Berkeley. So there's different ways to motivate what we're doing, but I think one motivation is just to pause and think about the fact, which maybe is surprising to some, maybe not others, but to me, it's kind of surprising when you think of it, that there's actually, if you think of values and beliefs around the world, it's surprisingly common that societies have what we're calling demotivating beliefs. So these are beliefs or norms, values that curb ambition and effort, that just says, don't work so hard, just, whoa, relax. And so a great example is Nordic countries have something called the law of Jante. And so this is 10 laws, and they basically come down to don't think that you're better than everyone else. Don't try and be better than everyone else. Okay, just try and fit in and be cohesive. And you think of the collectivism, individualism divide from social psychology fitting into that, definitely. Australia, New Zealand, something called the tall poppy syndrome. So this is just a quick rule of thumb. You can remember it. The tall poppy that sticks up gets cut off, right? Japan, something very similar. The nail that sticks up gets hammered down. And then if we think of beliefs like evil eye, so evil eye, what is that? It's people can harm you because of envy through kind of supernatural. And a lot of what we in the West would call witchcraft beliefs or traditional religious beliefs in many smaller scale societies also have beliefs like that. So if you don't share enough, or if you're not nice enough to people, that they can harm you through supernatural means, right? And in fact, once you start reading about this, it's really historically, and so across time and across space, deviations from these beliefs, it seems exceptional. So people who have written about the cultural foundations or the moral foundations of the Industrial Revolution, one thing that is very common, and here's just David McClellan, Alan McFarland, Deirdre McCloskey, Max Weber, what's common to all of those is these demotivating beliefs erode. And then you have other beliefs or norms that say it's okay to work hard, it's okay to obtain profit, it's okay to be an entrepreneur, right? And so we wanted to study this, and we connect this, or this is kind of actually the thing that we initially started with. We were also interested in is some previous research by George Foster in the late 60s and early 70s, where basically, according to his story, which is based on field work, one defining characteristic of smaller scale societies is because there's little innovation, there's little economic specialization, so Smithian growth, little economic growth in general, little innovation. Almost everything you can think of that's good or positive is in limited supply, right? Political power, land, spouses, prestige, and even like happiness and health to the extent that they're endogenous to those things, right? So one person's gain comes at the expense of others. So the world is, in these small scale societies, according to his theory, his narrative, is zero sum. And he calls this the image of limited good. So this is just a subconscious worldview that people have, that the world has limited good in it. So if one person does better, that's coming at the expense of others, okay? And what we're gonna do here is basically take his hypotheses and formalize them. And then we're going to connect them to these demotivating beliefs, right? And that's kind of what he did in words, is he connected then this worldview to envy, norms about sharing, witchcraft beliefs, etc. Okay. So I already mentioned this. We're going to formalize his argument, deriving testable predictions. And then we're going to actually take these to the data. We're going to do this with two samples. One, so we spent a lot of time in 2015 because we were interested in testing Foster in the DRC, and just thinking about how do you measure zero-sum thinking is not obvious, or an image of limited good. And then once you figure this out, how do you measure the other things that we want to connect it to? So that's why we have two samples. One is 2015. It's a smaller sample, but we did a more extensive set of measurement and cross-validation. And then in 2019, once we thought we got good measures, we went back and then replicated it And that's a larger sample of about 1,000 individuals. The 2015 is 200 individuals. And then also in the World Values Survey, there's one question which you can plausibly interpret as measuring an image of limited good or zero-sum thinking. And the great thing about that is you have it for, rather than 1,000 people, 250,000 people, right? And across 72 countries. So we're going to push it as far as we can. One interesting thing is that Foster, in some sense, implicitly thinks that the image of limited good does not apply to post-industrial, larger-scale societies, but it's what he calls peasant societies. But we're going to find evidence that's not true, and I'll talk through that. Okay, so that's basically the motivation. Just pause there in case there's any questions, and otherwise I'll take you through the model and we'll see exactly Foster's argument in math and the consequences of it. Okay, great. So there's a population, it's a continuum of mass 1, time is continuous, and then individuals are going to be characterized by adherence to a set of cultural beliefs, and that's going to index, or that's going to be our index. So it's a little different. I is not going to index individuals, but all individuals that share a certain cultural belief. And there's going to be a set of n possible beliefs, and then each belief, theta I, is going to lie between 0 and 1. So I haven't told you the significance of this belief or what does that mean, but I'll do that in a few slides. And so just purely on notation, as is common, QI is going to denote the share of the population that believes in theta I, right? And then the vector of belief prevalence, the full vector of the population distributions of the different beliefs is just going to be this bold Q. Okay, so that's all pretty standard. So this is where a zero-sum world or an image of a limited good world comes in, and this is how we chose to model it. So individuals are going to be matched and they're going to produce. Okay, so this could be a business relationship, this could be competition, one business relative to another business down the street. It could be farmers competing for labor, or competing for fertilizer, anything like this. So there's many interpretations. So each is going to produce and choose the amount of effort devoted to production. Okay, so this is all pretty standard. Effort's going to generate output, which is a x to the 1/2, right? Or a times the square root of x. A is technology, x is effort. And there's going to be a cost, which is just 1/2 x. Okay, so it's just very simple to make the math easy. And then the key here is production consists of a series of tasks, and a fraction alpha of the tasks are zero sum. So what does that mean? That means for those tasks, my gain comes at the expense of my partner. Okay, so if we're competing for customers, it could be that part of my profits that comes because I stole customers away from my competitor. If it's a joint venture, like we're in business together, sure, there's going to be some joint production, but at some point we're going to have to share the profits. Okay, and it's that, how important is that sharing part? That in the overall process, that's going to be governed by alpha or denoted by alpha. Okay, so that's one interpretation. The other interpretation was just we have a joint venture with some probability, all the production is zero sum, right? It's not going to be any risk aversion here. So it's kind of just some way of capturing how zero sum my relationship is with this other person in the production process. Okay, and so what does this mean? Output is going to be given, so this is output of two types, type I and type J, and assuming that they match. So the easiest start to the right, maybe the fraction 1 minus alpha of tasks don't have this negative externality, right? So basically my output is just equal to basically my effort, the production function, a x to the 1/2. But with the fraction alpha, I'm going to produce output because I exert effort x, right? But then it matters what my partner has done. And then, so some of my output for those fraction of tasks that is produced is going to be taken by my partner. And so that's minus axj to the 1/2, okay? And it's symmetric for the other individual. Their output is increasing in their effort, but decreasing in my effort, okay? And so just examples, I think this is very clear to this audience, but if alpha is equal to 0, we have our standard production function. If alpha is equal to 1, you have something that looks more like a contest success function. And then the general case where alpha is between 0 and 1, is represented by this here. Okay. Okay, so there's a few things we immediately know. If alpha is greater than 0, so the world's at least a little bit zero sum, the epsilon zero sum, then the equilibrium levels of effort are higher than is socially optimal. Okay, so there's a negative externality that one individual in the partnership exerts on the other. That's not taken into account in their optimization decision. Okay, so we know this in general. And so if both I and J reduce their effort slightly, both would be better off. Okay. And so that's a fact. And then so what we're going to do here is allow for demotivating beliefs that lower the perceived returns to effort. And these are these thetas, right? Theta I. This could be everything that I just mentioned: tall poppy syndrome, evil eye, the fact that people are jealous, so envy could emerge in society, the beliefs about supernatural harm, beliefs about the importance of sharing, that's going to lower the return to effort. So we're going to assume the return to effort is perceived to be lower by a fraction theta. And so what does this mean? This is the true material payoff to an individual. And so we saw this was the production and then just minus the cost of effort for player I, or type I should say. But the perceived subjective payoff, so what they think is actually happening, because there is this supernatural beliefs, for example, in the evil eye, is going to be A, and then they're going to discount the returns to their own effort by 1 minus theta I, because they're a type I. That's their belief. Okay. And then just to remind you, alpha is the zero sumness of production, and the theta I is the demotivating belief. So the higher theta I is, the greater the discount, the stronger the demotivating belief. Okay. And in equilibrium, equilibrium effort in terms of the investment or xi is given by this expression here. So 1 minus theta I squared and a squared. So the higher is technology, the greater the returns to effort. And then, but also these demotivating beliefs, the higher they are, the lower the perceived returns to effort, and therefore the lower is effort. Okay. Okay, so there's going to be some
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
Sorry, can
sure.
I? Do you assume, is there an assumption? So the people don't know who they interact with? You don't know who their partner is because it doesn't, so
Yeah.
xi star doesn't depend on x or theta j, or?
Yeah, so I'll talk about matching right now. It's going to be kind of mechanical and not strategic. And then, but that's exactly right. Like, everything I've said so far is like, oh, sure, both people would be better off if they reduced effort. And then there's this theta I, which will reduce effort. That doesn't mean in equilibrium you magically get a reduction in effort, right? So we need to know how do matches occur exactly. And so this is what we've assumed. And then obviously you could do something more complicated, but it'll highlight what you need and then provide predictions for the empirics. So there's going to be some degree of positive assortative matching. I think this is what you're getting at a little bit, is, well, with probability sigma, you're going to have an own type match. And with probability 1 minus sigma, you're going to have a random match. Okay. So there could be some, you do observe different interpretations. You could observe this other individual with certain probability, and then you'll match up with like-minded individuals. I think the way I would interpret this, just in general, there's homophily in networks, in social networks, right? This is very clear. We know this. It seems to be pretty universal. You match with, you make friends with, you enter into business relationships with people who are similar to you. Okay, it could be positive sort of matching on certain types, and then that generates homophily. And so that just will naturally generate matching like this. The other thing is one could assume group level, some form of group level selection, and then competition between relatively homogeneous villages, for example. That would get you. That's just another way of stating homophily in a more extreme, in a more structured way. Right, so that's the assumption. So with probability sigma, you're going to have an own type match. With probability 1 minus sigma, you're going to have a random match, right? And it's going to be important, obviously, sigma has to be greater than 0, as we'll see, for demotivating beliefs to arise. Okay, if it's just pure random matching, you're not going to have that. And then we're going to have the evolution of types is governed by a standard replicator dynamic. Okay, so as you all know, a population share is increasing in its fitness relative to other types. So how well that type does relative to other types. If it does better, on average, it'll grow. If it does worse on average, it'll decline. And then, but the key here is fitness is determined by true material payoffs. So whether you can feed yourself is what's important, not how happy you are in your mind, right? So that's important. Okay. And so I'll just do a little bit of talking about the equilibrium, or basically defining some terms. Material welfare, right? Or sometimes, material welfare, we'll call it, for a type at time t is going to equal material payoffs evaluated at the equilibrium effort level. So we assume that individuals are always optimizing in terms of their effort, and then averaged overall interaction. So we'll see that the results that we have aren't about just being in an evolutionary stable equilibrium. It's about the path, even if you're out of equilibrium, or out of a stable equilibrium, that is. So material welfare is going to differ at different points in time. It's going to depend on the distribution of types in the population, right? And it's going to equal probably sigma. You're going to get the welfare, the material welfare of a type I matching to a type I. Okay, this is material welfare for a type I. And then with probably 1 minus sigma, it's going to be a random match. So it's the population probability multiplied by the welfare you get when a type I matches that type J. Okay, and so you'll have the well-being from matching a type I here, but then also with probably 1 minus sigma, you'll also match a type I, and so that enters into both. And then subjective well-being is just the exact same thing, right? We're still assuming everyone's optimizing. Probably a matching depends on the proportion of types in the population, but this is just their subjective payoffs rather than their material payoffs. Okay, and so these things will differ to the extent that subjective payoffs differ from material payoffs. Okay, so that's the setup, super simple. I think obviously you can think of ways to make it more complex, or you might think, okay, this is not quite realistic enough, but I think it'll derive some predictions that are pretty rich, or I think it does derive predictions that are pretty rich that we can take to the data. Okay, so here are the propositions. So after enough time, this belief here, so theta star, which is sigma times alpha, is going to be driven to fixation, right? And so the true belief, so it's starting anywhere, right, with any initial population distribution, and as long as enough time has passed, and the true belief is going to be driven to extinction, right? So you're going to get some demotivating beliefs if enough time has passed, and obviously if sigma is greater than 0 and alpha is greater than 0, you're going to get some demotivating beliefs in the population. Okay, so I think that's just what I said. I think that's clear to everyone. You need some zero sumness, and you need some positive assortative matching, right? And in some sense, basically what this means is your reduction in your effort, which helps the other person, is reciprocated, right? That's why you need that. So material welfare. So this is the same thing. So we talked about material welfare, and then the one implication of that, or it follows from proposition 1, is, well, because there is an optimal demotivating belief, right? So there is an optimal theta, there is an optimal type that's going to come to dominate. If you take an environment where everyone's has the same zero sumness of the world, so the world's a fixed given zero sumness, then there's going to be a optimal demotivating belief. So then the interesting thing is that demotivating belief is going to maximize income, right? Or whatever you think material welfare can be measured by. And then as you deviate from that, then the income is going to decline. So there should be a hump shape if you're looking at income or material welfare, and how it varies by how demotivating the belief is that an individual holds. Okay. So that can be contrast to subjective well-being. So remember, material welfare, subjective well-being, they're not the same, and it's this 1 minus alpha that's multiplied by the effort term. With subjective well-being, you get something that's very different. Essentially, it's declining in the demotivating belief. Okay, and that's kind of intuitive because your returns are multiplied by 1 minus alpha. So you exert effort, you get returns, but you're less happy about it. There is this weird thing is where it flattens out at the end and then can even go up slightly, but you can kind of see that quantitatively that's not important. And in the data, we actually see this, but I think that's probably a fluke. So that's basically what's happening here is material welfare is, subjective well-being is pretty much declining in the demotivating beliefs. Okay, and that's basically because you're less happy or you get less welfare from the returns of your effort, right? So that's in contrast to the hump shape in terms of material welfare. Okay, so both of those, I should have emphasized this, are for a fixed degree of zero-sumness. So we're looking at one society, then looking across individuals within the society is kind of a way to think of it. So we can also look across groups. So let's just look across groups on average. And now instead of having a fixed zero sum, the comparative static of interest is let's allow the zero sumness of that group's environment to change. Okay. So we now consider variation between populations and we define a set of groups K, we're going to index them by K, and each has its own degree of zero sumness. And it's very unclear, and I'll talk more about this when we get to the data, how you define the boundaries of these groups, right? It could be like location, that makes sense, country, but even a neighborhood. Also industry and occupation, so how zero-sum competition for assistant professor jobs is going to be different than how zero-sum employment is in Amazon, for example. Social networks, class, age, gender, etc. Okay. We're going to assume that each group has the same degree of positive assortative matching, so that homophily networks is the same everywhere and same set of potential demotivating beliefs. So mean demotivating beliefs is just given by this, which is the population weighted average of demotivating beliefs in population K. And then we have 3 more propositions. Looking across groups, as long as enough time has passed, the mean strength of demotivating belief, or this average here, is increasing in the degree of zero-sumness. Okay, and that makes sense because the zero-sumness, well, remember that theta star is equal to sigma times alpha, and then zero-sumness is one of the reasons, or the reason why you would have a demotivating belief in equilibrium. So the more zero-sum your world is, the more beliefs about that discourage effort are likely to emerge, right? It's the zero-sumness that generates the negative externality of one individual on another in production, and then that negative externality is part of the reason that demotivating beliefs exist, right? As long as you have some positive sort of matching. And then, so looking across groups, as long as enough time has passed, with a more zero-sum environment, remember, we know that there's more demotivating beliefs, and what are the consequences of those? Those lower effort, and they lower material welfare. Okay, so these are all decreasing. Okay, so just why is this prediction different than the other? Remember, the other was there's a hump shape. That's fixing alpha. So we have a given zero-sum environment. Then there's an optimal demotivating belief. Here it's saying the more zero-sum the environment is, the more demotivating the belief is, right? Another way to think of this is like the more demotivating the optimal belief is as well, right? But this is an equilibrium statement, right? Right, and then that affects material welfare. And then subjective well-being, we have the same type of scenario as before. As you increase zero-sumness, we know that demotivating beliefs are going to increase, and then effort's going to decrease, material welfare is going to decrease, and all of that is going to mean that your subjective well-being is going to decrease. Okay. And then the corollary from following from this is, so everything here was in terms of comparative static as you changed how zero-sum the world is, and these other things change, but zero-sum is linked to average demotivating beliefs. So you can state these as, well, if average demotivating beliefs in society are higher, then effort should be lower, material welfare should be lower, subjective well-being should be lower. Okay, so that's another prediction that you can get. Okay, so that's the theory. Any questions about that? So it's a lot of propositions, and but I'll review each step by step. and as we go through the empirics, right?
I'm wondering what is the exact statement of like when enough time has passed? Does it mean that we're close to a steady state, or what is this?
Yeah, exactly. As you're getting, because the statement is like with any initial population distribution. So of course you could pick starting points in which these things don't hold, just because you're starting in a place that's, you know, you're starting wherever. So then you just need, okay, we need to allow the system to run and get close enough to the steady state. Exactly. So there's a formal, I don't have it memorized, but there's a formal statement which is going to, you know, depend on the initial, but in general you can show as long as you get close. And so the other way to do this as well, which would be slightly less general, is just to say at the steady state, right? All of this would hold. So exactly, yeah. So it's exactly what you're thinking. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions,
Nathan,
Arthur? Yeah.
I was wondering, not that it's necessarily plausible, but what would it take to get the first best? What sort of and why is that inaccessible here? Why some kind of transfers, taxes, subsidies would make people work in an appropriate way, and why couldn't that happen? I guess.
That's a good question. I think you can get the first best. I think so. So remember, material welfare's. Oh, I think so. If sigma is equal to 1, you have perfect positive assortative matching. Then I think you can get first best, right? Because then you're going to get enough time is run so that everyone's now the belief system is theta star. So I think that's right. So you have homogeneous groups. Any effort is reciprocated. I think that's the first best, but I have to check, right? So with perfect positive assortative matching, or that's kind of group level selection and allowing the system to run, then people are, I think they're going to choose belief systems that are the first best, but I'd have to, yeah. Does that sound right to you, or it's hard to say? Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. But yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I'll write that down because that might be good for us to note in the paper, actually. Yeah.
Another thing about the way the payoffs are set up, you have my payoff depends on what I do, and then we subtract a term from what you do from J, and then there's another term that just depends on me. It looks like I should do, although I'm not going to like you to have a high payoff, it's going to lower mine. It doesn't seem to change the incentives at the margin. So, and it must be it must be the assortative part that's giving, somehow changing that, right?
Well, I think it's the functional forms that we chose, right? That you get the X star is just 1 minus theta. So yeah, so if we had a different functional form in terms of production, because it's basically you take the derivative of output. You can probably see it here. Take the derivative of output with respect to my effort. Yeah. Right. You can see there's no interaction. So if we had xi and xj interacting, then you're going to have xj, and it's just going to, I think it'll, obviously you'd see that the math here is going to be very simple, which is nice. So, but you could have some different strategic interactions beyond what we have here. And so that's the only reason, nothing deeper than that. Yeah. Christoph? I
just wanted to comment that I think this is sort of consistent with some of the literature that I'm aware of, that there's this paper by Edi Dekel, Jeff Ely, and Okan Yilankaya, where they basically generally studied the evolution of preferences in games. And basically when you have, so what you have a situation here where the equilibrium is inefficient, there's something more efficient out there. And basically you can have a setup where you can observe other people's preferences, which in some sense you can in your case, because you have assortative matching, basically means you must be able to observe, right? Then you get a push towards efficiency. So there's a general sort of statement out there in some sense, but this is consistent with that, and this. So I just wanted to point that out. Okay, that's great. Yeah. If you have the reference after, and then I've written down a subset of the authors. You can put it in the chat. Yeah. Okay, terrific. Yeah, great. So great, Ingela. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. So indeed, it's very much in line with quite a few papers out there. And I have I have a question though on, because this is exactly what is found out, that you go towards more efficiency as the social activity increases and so forth. And so I have a question though, because when you motivate by, for example, the Jante law, which the puppy, it's kind of, you should not be better than others, but here it's more an absolute pessimism about what the return.
Right.
And so I was wondering why you chose to do this, to model it this way as an absolute. It could be like laziness in some sense, right? You could also put this theta in the cost function, saying that, well, subjective cost of effort. And so I was curious to hear why you chose to model it this way.
Yeah, so I think there's definitely lots of different ways that you could put in the theta or something theta-like. So I wouldn't be against, having it in the cost function. You overestimate your costs, and actually some of the measures are going to be like that, right? Like, what are the returns to effort? That's a natural measure. And if I think, oh, there's hardly any returns to effort, that's thinking like, oh, costs are a lot higher, or is one way to interpret it. But you can also interpret it this way, right? Like my effort is going to generate less outcome. I think like the one thing also that you mentioned, which you could do, which I think would just complexify things, is say it's effort relative to the mean, right? Or maybe it ends up being isomorphic, I don't know. So it's my effort. If my effort is higher than average, then that's when I start to discount it, because I feel bad because I'm doing much better than the average, right? And I think in reality, a lot of these values and beliefs are like that. Like if you think of, I'll talk about the setting I know most well, the DRC. It's basically like traditional religious beliefs. If you're doing exceptional, then the beliefs are, because you kind of view the world in zero-sum terms, that exceptional gain must have come from someone else, right? So it's always going to be relative to the mean. But I think you would get something similar, but then you're going to have to think about what people perceive to be the mean, or their expectations about the mean. But I agree, like in terms of the mapping, this is like a very crude way of saying, let's just, bluntly assume that your returns are discounted by this amount, right? Yeah. Okay, great. Oh, one more question, Minhua.
Yeah, so one of the possible mechanisms for there being a demotivating belief that you mentioned is a sharing norm. And I mean, in the case of that, I'm just wondering why the demotivating belief is only added to the focal individual's effort, but not their partner's effort. Because if you believe that there is a sharing norm and your partner would also be subject to the same norm, then you should also expect their return to not be as efficient.
Yeah, so two things. So it is the case that they expect the returns to their effort to be less efficient. So I think there's two things you're saying. So let me just in case you're not saying this. So if you did the welfare of a type J match with the type I, you would have type J's effort being discounted, right? So in that sense, it's symmetric. But I think also what you're saying is, well, and we had a version of this. This was the first version where this 1 minus alpha I discounts the total production, not just the returns to your effort. And then it's basically then interpretation, right? It doesn't matter. All the math, everything, like the predictions are identical. There's like the proofs are going to be slightly different, but and it just determine or is related to how you're interpreting 1 minus alpha. And so if it is sharing norms, or if I have more in general, then others will be suspicious, right? So that would be 1 minus alpha multiplies the whole production. That would be natural. And then this, what we have here is more like, oh, if I believe that hard work doesn't generate output, right? Or the returns to hard work are lower, then this specification is kind of a bit more natural, right? So I think it really just, it's hard to have one model that encompasses all of these. And then, but I think, let me just say that if the 1 minus alpha multiplies output rather than effort, you're going to have everything is almost identical, right? And one might cover certain cases better than others. Yeah. Okay, any other questions for the, okay. Okay, so we'll talk about the empirics. I think everyone gets, probably even better than I do, gets the intuition, understands what's going on here. And so we're going to cover two samples. I mentioned this already, from the Democratic Republic of Congo. So we spent a lot of time here thinking about how do you measure a zero-sum mindset, how zero-sum a person's world is, etc. This is coming from the city of Kananga. So it's a city that's 1.8 million people. So you might think this isn't a small-scale society like Foster was talking about. We think it's actually a pretty good laboratory, because what it is it was a city that didn't exist, and then the Belgians came in and they thought we need to create a capital city right in the center of, roughly in the center of the country. The capital ended up being Kinshasa, which is on the coast, but they were trying to create this capital city. It was called Luluabourg at the time. And then, so you had this immigrant population coming from the countryside, from these small villages, which are like 20 to 200 households. And today it's 1.8 million individuals, but they are essentially all first or second generation immigrants on average. And there's still a lot of migration. And so this is in the, what's now the province of Kasai Central. And so you're able to get a lot of people from different diverse backgrounds within this one location, right? And then the other one is an industrialized global sample from the World Values Survey. And I write this industrialized global because it's supposed to be all across the world, but it's only 72 countries. And for example, the Congo is not in the sample, but Egypt is, right? In terms of African countries, Nigeria is, South Africa is. So these are the most industrialized of all the countries are going to be in the sample here. Okay, so there's two empirical challenges. We've talked about these a little bit, some of them, but or I've touched on them. So one is we don't really observe the boundaries of groups, right? So we don't observe these K, so we don't really know what to look across. What I'm going to show you, so remember it's a city of 1.8 million people, and we randomly sample 200. So I think it's reasonable to think we're taking one person from a different group, a different social group, right? And so what we can do is just look across individuals and have in mind the predictions that's across K. So different individuals in different neighborhoods, depending on their level of income, their occupation, et cetera, are going to have a more or less zero-sum world. So that's a theta K. And then, but we'll have to worry about independence. So in the paper, there's a bunch of checks or corrections for violations of assumptions of non-independence, right? That's more of a minor thing. I think the big thing is, well, how do you measure how zero-sum the world is? So if you just think about like, okay, the world today, look outside, and all the interactions you're engaged with, everything you do in terms of production today, between 0 and 1, how zero-sum are those interactions, right? And so you might think 0, but what about, if we publish a paper in a great journal, that's one less spot for someone else, things like this. Get a grant, that's one less grant for someone else. So it's really hard to quantify this. So what we're going to do, and we thought about this for a long time, and what seems to work best is just ask people how zero-sum your world is. Okay, ask them many different times in many different ways, and then we'll have a measure. Okay, and so I'll show you exactly this. So these are the types of responses that we used. It's a two-statement, right? So we don't want just like affirmation bias or some bias, people saying, sure, I agree with whatever you asked me. So it's two statements, it's symmetric. If one person in a village gets very wealthy, other people in the village will become poorer. And that's statement one. Statement two, if one person in the village gets very wealthy, other people in the village will not necessarily become poorer, right? So both can't be true. They're like polar opposites. And then you choose the extent to which you agree with one or two. Of course, your view might be specific to villages and people. So we asked this a bunch of times. Hopefully you can see this. In Kananga, people only make money when others lose money. In Kananga, businesses only make money when others lose money. If one person in a village gets wealthy, others will be poorer. Trade, and then power, and then happiness. So this was like a baseline set of questions that we thought were conservative. Then we had other questions where we thought, okay, let's have a wider variety of settings. So here's about farmers having a huge crop. If one farmer has a huge crop, his neighbor will also have a huge crop or will have a small crop. The success of the wealthy, generally helps or hurts others in the community. So the first questions, we really stayed away from having more loaded questions, although this is all translated into Chaluba and then back translated. So it's not clear if this would be loaded in their language, but helps and hurts. Here we say exploiting, right? That's even a bit more loaded. And then here, taking away from others, okay? And then the last two is we ask about God and we ask about ancestral spirits. That's a domain that's very different, right? And so I think there's some interesting things here. These are all kind of reordered. So we switch kind of which appears first and second. They're reordered so that if a positive factor loading means it's loading on a more zero-sum answer. And you see you get pretty equal weights. And so this is principal components analysis. You get pretty equal weights on each of these measures, okay? And that was true in 2015 and then in 2019 again. Columns 3 and 4, we only have these larger questions, or sorry, a more extensive set of questions for 2015 when we were first trying to decide what's the best measure. And you can see here that these all load positively, not quite as strongly. And then this one doesn't correlate at all or load at all, right? And I think it's because the statement is most of the wealth was created or was obtained by taking it from others. So people in their mind don't literally think that business that's wealthier stole from the other business, but the world is zero sum and it did come at the expense of the others, right? And then the Christianity question loads, but less so the ancestral spirits question, okay? And so what we're gonna use, it doesn't matter at all. This is the correlation between the first principal component of all those different types of questions, the different columns, whether it's 6 question, 10 question, 12 question. And it really doesn't matter at all, but we'll use the 6 question just because we have that for 2019 so we can replicate, right? And so those are a bunch of questions. We have first principal component. It's reassuring that it loads positively. But can we really test that? How is there a way of testing really? And so we didn't have great ideas. This is the best we came up with. So this is another type of question, which is a vignette. So it's saying on day 1, so Dituku is day in Chaluba. There's 2 sellers of bananas on the side of the road, Kapinga and Chilomba. Kapinga sells 10 bananas, Chilomba sells 20. Then on day 2, Kapinga sells 20. How many does Chilomba sell? So first we allow them to enter any number. And then we say, okay, if there's 2 options, 40 or 10, which do you choose? And there's 2 logics, right? If demand is zero sum or the sales are zero sum, then Chilomba should sell 10, right? So the total sales is always equal to 30. But a non-zero sum view is, oh, there's a demand shock, something's going on, and everyone sells twice as much on that day. And so that would be, the non-zero sum view would be 40, okay? And so basically there's 2 types of answers here. And so the zero sum choice and then the non-zero sum choice. And then we just look at the distribution of the zero sum principal components measures across the 2. And basically you see if you answered a zero sum choice, then your zero sum survey answers tend to be more zero sum, right? And same thing here, same idea, but 2 farmers. And in 1 year, one farmer grows $50 of corn, the other 100. And then in the second year, this farmer grows 100, what is the other? And you have the same patterns here, okay? So we take this at least as some evidence that, okay, maybe these things are capturing something reasonable in terms of reality, okay? Okay, so we're also gonna measure envy, because the emergence of envy might be another way or another interpretation of theta. So you can just see, I won't read out all the questions, but envy questions, and then they report the extent to which they agree with these. And then we'll take the first principal component. Here's the factor loadings in the 2 samples, so it loads positively. So I think everything makes sense. It triangulates. Religious belief questions. So these are what in the West we would call witchcraft. I think it was traditional religions. And you can kind of read those. Just how often do you pray to ancestral spirits? How often do you participate in rituals? And then the 4th is you show a figure and say, how close do you feel to other non-Christians in the city? And that loads again positively on each of these measures in both samples. So, and we'll take the first principal component. Same with Christianity, and we'll look at that as well. and you have a measure of that. Okay, so how do these correlate? This is just looking at the relationship between how zero-sum the world is and then demotivating beliefs. So the alpha and the theta, and we're interpreting these as across worlds to some extent, right? Across populations. And so if your world is more zero-sum, or you perceive it to be more zero-sum, then basically there's greater envy, okay? You have stronger beliefs in traditional religions, okay? And so this is completely consistent with Foster. And then weaker Christianity beliefs, okay? And then the gap between the two, if you thought, because a lot of people believe in both, right? So if you thought, okay, it's a difference between these beliefs in this area that has this kind of dual belief system that matters, you find this pattern here as well, okay? Yeah, and then Christianity, I could talk a lot more about this, but it's really interesting from focus groups. This is something we saw early on. It's not talked about by Foster as much, that if you ask people, like, if one person in the village becomes happier, does that mean others will be less happy? They'll say yes, right? If one person's kid is more healthy, people's kids will be less healthy, they'd say yes. But as soon as you ask about, and we have some data on this, blessings from God, if God blesses one individual, does that mean others are less likely to get blessings? They say no, right? So this belief system just is not very zero-sum compared to traditional beliefs, right? And we see that. And then this is the 1,000 person sample, so kind of replicating, we see the same basic patterns. And then these are smaller in magnitude and less significant for whatever reason, but otherwise everything holds, okay? And then I should have mentioned this, these include like basic demographic controls and ethnicity fixed effects. What happened here? Okay, so that's from the DRC. I think that's everything we're going to cover from the DRC. Then we're going to move to the World Value Survey, which gives us this much denser sample. So I think we're going to be able to test some of the more intricate predictions. I'll talk about those. And in the World Value Survey, there is one question, which is this question: wealth can grow so there's enough for everyone. That's statement one. Statement two: people can only get rich at the expense of others. And you choose a number between 1 to 10 on that scale that best represents your own view. So you can see that this is imperfect. About wealth growing, so that might be more about economic growth than on the one side than anything, but it's kind of the best that we have in terms of widely available survey data. And in another paper I have with Sahil Shenoy, Sandra Sequeira, and Stephanie Stancheva, we have this survey question and then also additional survey questions from the United States. And we kind of show that they're highly correlated. So we do a cross-validation. So it's available in waves 2, 3, 5, and 6. And also, waves 2, 3, 5, and 6. And this tells you the distribution across those waves, right? So this is the most non-zero sum view and then the most zero sum view here. Okay. And so basically we'll just run regressions where zero sum perceptions are the X variables. And then the outcomes are going to be demotivating beliefs. But then we also have really rich data on education, savings, occupation, and income. So we can see how zero-sum thinking affects those as well. And then you can also have the X variable be demotivating beliefs, right? And that's corollary 2 and how that affects those. And then the other great thing is we have information on life satisfaction, happiness. You can test those predictions. Okay, so one thing we see immediately is zero-sum thinking is associated with more demotivating beliefs. So we've flipped these questions in many cases. So let's see here. Hard work brings success. Usually fully agree is 1 and then fully disagree is 0, but we flip them so that always a higher number means more demotivating beliefs. Okay, so you don't think hard work brings success in general if you perceive the world around you to be zero-sum, or if the world around you is more zero-sum. Okay, and so you can kind of read each of these. This is about how humiliating it is to receive money from others, how important is work to you. And just I'll note the number of observations differs because these questions were asked or not in certain waves. Okay, so column 1 and column 6 is obviously the largest sample with about 250 thousand individuals. Okay, and if you look at economic outcomes, a zero-sum thinking or a zero-sum world is associated with lower income, less savings, less education, more manual tasks, so more unskilled tasks, less management, and then your perception that you're in a lower economic class. Okay, so that's consistent. We interpret those as measures of either X star or material well-being. Okay, and then subjective well-being. I'm just going to show you the plot because I showed you those other plots. There is some evidence of flattening out here, like we saw with the figures. But in general, you find the more zero-sum your world is, the lower is subjective well-being, and this is measured using happiness and then life satisfaction. Okay, and so that's kind of the standard questions. If we run regressions, this is zero-sum thinking. The outcome is always happiness, and you find a negative relationship there. And then here with life satisfaction, a negative relationship. And then the other prediction, which is corollary 2, is demotivating beliefs should be associated with less happiness. Okay, and these are what this reports here is the different X variables, right? So this X variable is associated with less happiness, that X variable is associated with less happiness. Okay, just the intuition of the model is that was 1 minus alpha multiplied by your income is equal to your subjective well-being. Okay, so that comes out very clearly. It's true with life satisfaction or happiness. And then I guess one other interesting thing here is because we don't need the zero-sum measure, you see that we get larger samples, right? Because the zero-sum wasn't asked in every survey, so you start to get quite large, even larger samples. Okay, so everything I've shown you, the interpretation is that's across groups. So that was propositions 4 to 6, and then the corollary. So across those K, because you saw that we're allowing the comparative static is what happens when zero-sum thinking or how zero-sum your world is changes. So what happens when alpha changes. But remember, there were those predictions 1 to 3 that were saying what happens across individuals when they're in the same world, when alpha is the same. So you fix how zero-sum your world is, and then there should be this hump shape, for example, in income and demotivating beliefs. So how can we do this with the data? Well, basically we have these deciles, these categories, 1 to 10, in what people answered. So then we can divide the whole sample, so 250,000 individuals, into these different deciles. And for those individuals, we could say, let's assume, or the presumption is how zero-sum their world is the same, okay? Because we're fixing their perception of how zero-sum the world is, which we think reflects how zero-sum the world is. So we can do this unconditionally. You can condition on survey, wave, and country fixed effects. So basically, if you think language and when they answer it is going to affect the answering of the question, the mapping from perception to reality, then that'll help improve upon that. Demographic controls, if different ages and genders answer differently, or you can condition on both. And that's what I'll show you today. It doesn't really matter at all, but I'll show you kind of the question, but netting out fixed effects and demographics. Okay, so once you do, yep.
Do you have any proxy for alpha, or what are you assuming?
Yeah, so this is our proxy for alpha. So alpha is how zero-sum the world is, right? And then they answer on a scale of 1 to 10 how zero-sum, is that question, which we interpret as how zero-sum is your world.
Okay.
And so we take that and then netting out things that might affect, like running a regression of alpha on these things and then taking the residual, right? So but the idea is alpha. Yeah, exactly. This survey question is our measure of alpha.
So you're assuming that corresponds to actual reality.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Yeah. So you can think about, is that the case? Or I can't think of a better strategy to measure actual reality across 250,000 individuals, but that's exactly right. Yeah. And you could have the whole model and not interpret alpha as reality, but alpha is your perception,
yes.
And it's going to be, pretty similar, just a slightly different interpretation. And so I don't have a strong view. But yeah, so that's exactly what alpha is the zero-sum question from the World Value Survey. We divide it into these different deciles, these bins, and look across individuals that have the same reported perception of how zero-sum their world is. And this was the prediction that you should get a hump shape. This is the demotivating belief. Work is not important, so it's increasing in theta. There is an optimal theta, right? And then income is the y variable. And so you get this hump shape consistently across all of these bins. And so that's suggesting that there, in some sense, in terms of income, there is an optimal demotivating belief. Okay, and so in general, you wouldn't see this if you don't net out or don't bin the data based on alpha. This is another measure. Hard work does not bring success, income. You can see that this has more options, and so it's kind of more continuous. But again, you see evidence of a hump shape, right? Some of the questions, if they just say yes or no, obviously that's the option. So you'd only have 0 or 1 here. You can't estimate a hump shape, but in the paper, we show you every variable for which you can estimate a non-monotonic pattern. If we look at happiness, so remember here is income, is the y variable, right? So that's material well-being. And then this is subjective payoffs, and so happiness, you don't see this hump shape, right? Which is interesting. You see this monotonic decline, or this monotonic decline, or this decline. Maybe some evidence of flattening out, like the figures, but in general, that's what you see for both of them, right? And so, so there's an optimal in terms of income, demotivating belief, but in terms of happiness, the more demotivating your perceptions, your belief, the less happy you are, and that's consistent with the model. Okay. Okay. So I have 2 minutes. Just the last thing I'm going to show you is Foster talked a lot about economic growth, and this is more exploratory. And if you thought the original model was crude or hokey, this is even going to be, technology here is going to be even more simplistic in some ways. But I think it's going to provide insights. So let's just think about growth, technological change in the setting. So A was exogenous, and obviously A affects effort and A affects output. So we're going to allow for technological change, and we're just going to assume it's increasing the average level of effort in society. Okay, and so technology is going to evolve according to this, and because we also allow for depreciation. Okay, so there's going to be some knowledge loss in society in general as knowledgable individuals die out, for example. And so what you get, so here's a case where Q, we're going to assume to some extent, basically, that there's 2 belief systems that exist, a theta that equals to 0, and then in this case, a theta that equals to 0.2, a theta that equals to 0, and a theta equal 0.4, theta equal to 0, and a theta equal to 0.8. Then Q is the proportion of individuals in the population that believe in the theta that's stated right below it. And then A is the level of technology. Okay, so there's a dynamic that if effort is high enough, technology will grow. Here, this is showing you this threshold. If it's below this, depreciation dominates and technology will decline. If it's above it, you're kind of technology grows and you're off to the races. Okay, so what happens when you have a demotivating belief? Remember, we showed that these can arise and these actually get you closer or to the first best. So they're a good thing, right? But that's in kind of static terms. Dynamically, you can see this threshold basically then changes, right? And so you're going to get, it's harder in some sense, right, as this vector plot shows, to get sustained economic growth, right? This cutoff shifts up. And here, this is if the demotivating belief is 0.4, here if the demotivating belief is 0.8. So demotivating beliefs solve this problem, but then in terms of economic growth, given these assumptions, it makes sustained economic growth more difficult. And this is one thing that Foster argued in his research, okay? And so this is interesting, I mentioned this, is like a lot of individuals, so historians, anthropologists, basically have argued, well, that's one thing that really happened during and maybe even preceded the Industrial Revolution. It was like the belief that prior to this, it was great to be wealthy, but you shouldn't work for your wealth, right? You had old wealth was good, new wealth was not good. So if you thought what happened during the Columbian Exchange, global trade, colonial rule, the world became less zero-sum for European nations. Maybe globally it was still zero-sum, but they were gaining a lot at the expense of Africans who were enslaved, indigenous populations which were depopulated. And so from the point of view of a society in Europe, the world is suddenly very positive sum. Okay, so what's going to happen there? Here's just an example. You could interpret this as alpha changing. Okay, so here's a case where alpha is 0.9. You could think of that as very zero sum prior to the Columbian exchange, and we'll assume that the the other theta that we're considering is always the optimal theta. Okay, and so basically you get a cutoff that's like this, move to a cutoff like this. So even if you were in this area here, which is non-sustained economic growth, with this transition, this lower theta from 0.9 to 0.5, you can now be in this kind of basin of attraction, if you want to think of it that way, of sustained economic growth, right? And even if it's only temporary, that could move you up to here. And then when you return back to a theta, or sorry, an alpha of 0.9, you're going to be in still this basin of attraction of sustained economic growth. Okay, so that's one interpretation, is basically the Columbian exchange, colonialism, made the world not very zero sum for European nations, less zero sum, and that reduced these demotivating beliefs. And this would be consistent with the writings of these scholars which I mentioned. Okay, and just a bit of fun evidence for this: if you just in Google Ngrams think about the word progress, right? In a zero sum world, progress doesn't really make sense as a society, right? The society is not improving. That's just not, in a zero sum world, that's just not possible, right? It's like we're all stuck the way we are, but you can see that the idea of progress, of society becoming better and better, emerges, right around the Industrial Revolution. Actually, even before, if you think the transition is somewhere around here, okay? And then other things like jealousy and envy, which are these demotivating beliefs, you don't see the same increase. So it's not just like all words are increasing, or and then these show a very different pattern. Okay, so obviously this is just descriptive, and there's lots of explanations for this, but I think it's interesting to think about these big picture issues in this context. So, and then just the very last thing I'll mention in case people are interested. This is part of a broader project. This project is kind of really the first paper thinking about the theory, thinking about empirics in this setting. One thing it taught us is, and the World Value Survey data teaches us, is while zero-sum thinking might be relevant for industrialized societies. And then the more we thought about it with other scholars, you think of US politics, there's a lot of zero-sum thinking going on. You think of immigration, and so with this original survey of 20,000 individuals, we start to try and understand the US context, how zero-sum thinking is related to values and beliefs, and then what the origins are. And so we find upward mobility being important, immigration, and a history of enslavement, which are the three things I think that are really characterize US history, is the American dream, land of immigrants, and unfortunately land that was built on slavery. Okay, so if you're interested, that's posted. And so it's just to know it's part of a broader research agenda. So I'll stop there since I've gone over a few minutes. So.